In the final weeks of his life, Pope Francis, the 266th successor of St. Peter, did not surround himself with fanfare, titles, or elaborate ceremonies. Instead, he quietly began to prepare his heart for eternity. And in the same spirit that defined his entire papacy, his final moments weren't marked by power, but by humility. Because even as the world called him Holy Father, he preferred to be seen as what he always was, a servant. Pope Francis had long rejected the trappings of the papal palace. From the start, he lived in the humble residence of Casa Santa Marta, choosing simplicity over luxury. As his health declined, his prayer life only deepened. Those closest to him noticed something shift. He grew quieter, more contemplative. He spent longer hours in the chapel, weeping during Mass, clutching his rosary as if it were the only thing anchoring him to this world. He confided in his personal aides that he wasn't afraid of death, but that he wanted to die as he lived, close to the people. And so, he refused grand preparations. He didn't want to lie in state with golden garments. He didn't want statues or marble plaques carved in his honor. His only request? When I die, let them bury me with Mary. Not in St. Peter's Basilica, not under the Vatican dome, but in the Basilica of St. Mary Major, beneath the image of the Salus Populi Romani, the protectress of the Roman people. The icon of the Virgin Mary he had prayed before every time he left the Vatican and every time he returned. She had been his companion in life, and he wanted her to be his resting place in death. Those who heard this final wish were stunned, not because it was shocking, but because it was so deeply Francis. He could have had anything. Instead, he chose the arms of a mother. As Pope Francis's health continued to decline, his words became fewer, but every one of them carried the weight of a soul already stepping into eternity. In his final days, those closest to him say he spoke not of fear, not of titles, not even of the future of the Church, but of love. Love for God, love for the poor, love for the wounded world he had spent his life trying to heal. He asked for silence, not because he was retreating, but because he was listening. He once told his confessor in a whisper, "I hear him more clearly now. The voice of Christ, it is gentle, but it calls with fire." To the sisters who cared for him, he kept repeating, "Have you hugged someone today?" Even from his sickbed, he was still giving commands, not of power, but of mercy. One evening, he requested that a small group of children from a nearby orphanage be brought in. He wanted to see them one last time. Though he could barely sit upright, he smiled as each child came forward, placing their little hands in his. With tears in his eyes, he whispered blessings over them, one by one. And then he said something they would never forget. "You are my treasure, not the walls of the Vatican. You." His last private conversation was with a young priest who had once confessed to doubting his calling. Pope Francis looked at him and said, "Even Peter doubted, but Jesus never doubted Peter." And then, holding the young man's trembling hands, he added, "Keep going. The Church needs wounded healers." These were not statements for history books. They were the words of a father, a shepherd, a man who never saw himself as above the flock, but as one of them. His power was never in his position. It was in his compassion. And all of it, the humility, the tears, the tenderness, came together in one final act that the world would soon witness. A request not for honor, but for anonymity. A burial not in marble, but in the shadow of Mary's silent protection. When the moment finally came, in the early morning hours of April 21st, 2025, Pope Francis passed away not surrounded by cardinals in marble halls, but in a small, quiet room holding a wooden crucifix with his rosary wrapped around his fingers. The words on his lips, barely audible, were the same ones he had prayed 1,000 times. "Jesus, Mary, thank you." And with that, the 88-year-old pontiff slipped into eternity, not with applause or ceremony, but with silence and light. The Vatican bells tolled. The world was notified. But in that small chapel where he died, the spirit of his life spoke louder than any headline. What followed was a funeral unlike any the modern church had seen. Gone were the towering golden vestments. Gone were the elaborate papal traditions. Instead, his body lay in a simple wooden coffin marked only with a small cross and a well-worn copy of the Gospels placed on top. No crown, no papal insignia, just the word he lived by and the humility he died with. He was not buried under the basilicas of emperors and saints. He had already made it known, with absolute clarity, that he wanted none of it. No vault, no monument, just a grave at the Basilica of St. Mary Major, where he had wept and prayed so often before Our Lady. There, beneath the icon of Salus Populi Romani, the humble Pope of the people was laid to rest. Quietly, as he wished, tens of thousands gathered in the streets of Rome, not because of his power, but because of his kindness. Pilgrims cried not just from loss, but from recognition, that they had been loved by a man who never saw himself as more than a servant. Heads of state bowed, refugees lit candles, children wept, and across every continent bells rang for a man who had taught the world that holiness wears no crown, it wears mercy. Long after the incense faded and the crowds dispersed, the final message of Pope Francis remained, not carved in stone, but written in witness. He didn't ask the world to remember him with statues, titles, or speeches. He asked to be remembered simply as a man who loved Jesus, loved Mary, and loved the poor. And in the end, it wasn't his theology that brought the world to tears. It was his simplicity, his sincerity, his refusal to be anything other than a servant. His death, humble, hidden, unadorned, preached the very gospel he had lived his entire life. The image of his final resting place beneath the Virgin's gaze says it all. No golden tomb, no marble portrait, just the humblest of men, in the humblest of graves, still entrusting his soul to the same mother he called upon in life. The man who held the keys of Peter asked only to die at Mary's feet. And what did his final wish mean? It meant that greatness isn't in titles, it's in tenderness. It meant that the church doesn't need more power, it needs more presence. It meant that the most powerful pope of our generation used his last breath to remind us how to be small. In a world obsessed with influence, Pope Francis chose intimacy. In a time of noise, he chose silence. In a church tempted by prestige, he chose the path of Christ crucified, poor, pierced, and praying. So yes, his last wish will leave you in tears, not because it was sad, but because it was so astonishingly pure. "Bury me with Mary," he said. And with those words, he gave us one final gift, a reminder that in the end, nothing matters but love, but love.